In the spring of 1946, months after the world had declared peace, there were still fences. Tall, wired, humming fences that held people in not out of punishment, but out of paperwork, protocol, and something far harder to define. On the outskirts of Texas, far from the front lines of Europe or the ruins of Berlin, Camp Raleigh remained one of the final operational detention sites for German prisoners of war. But these weren't the soldiers everyone imagined with rifles and steel helmets. These were women, secretaries, medics, translators. Some were volunteers. Others had been forced into service. And one of them, a 26-year-old from Wurzburg named Liesl Geiger, had not spoken a word since the night the train stopped in El Paso. Liesl had arrived a year earlier. In 1945, as part of a quiet, classified transfer. She and a group of female detainees had been relocated from Europe for security reasons. A vague term often whispered about when it came to anything involving intelligence or sensitive material. What she knew, what she might say, what she had seen in places like Kassel, or perhaps deeper inside military command centers, was never revealed. But her silence made her a mystery. And in the world of camp guards and Red Cross workers, mysteries didn't last long before they turned into rumors. That some said she had fallen in love with an American officer. Others said she had betrayed her own unit to save civilians. A few believed she had witnessed a massacre and simply shut down. None of it was confirmed. She didn't deny or correct anyone. She simply existed pale, quiet, and always with the same folded photograph in her coat pocket. The photo, faded and creased from hundreds of touchings, showed a young man in uniform standing beside a tree in full bloom. Some guards joked that it wasn't even her lover, that she had taken it from someone else. But if anyone tried to touch it, her hands would clench so tightly that her knuckles turned white dot in Camp Raleigh. Routines were king. Wake-up calls, inspections, meal lines, sewing workshops, language classes. For the women who had lost homes, families, and futures, the rhythm of order was a strange kind of mercy. But for Liesl, it was a prison of its own. Every morning, she walked to the farthest corner of the fence, where the shadow of the guard tower stretched across the dry Texas dirt, and she would stand for exactly 1 hour, never speaking, never moving, only watching. Some thought she was waiting for someone. Others said it was a ritual away to hold on to what little she had left. Then, in June, the order came. Camp Raleigh was to shut down within 30 days. All female detainees would be processed for repatriation. Ships had been arranged. German authorities, now under Allied supervision, were expecting them. Most of the women reacted with mixed feelings: relief, fear, even joy. But not Liesl. She sat in her bunk, staring at the creased photograph, until lights out. And the next day, she stood at the fence again. But this time, something had changed. In her hands, instead of the photo alone, she now carried a small envelope, sealed with a string. Sergeant William Rhodes, who had been stationed at Raleigh for over a year, noticed it immediately. He had observed Liesl many times from the tower, often wondering what her story was. Unlike many of the guards, he didn't treat the prisoners with indifference or cruelty. He saw them as people trapped by forces far beyond their control, people like Liesl, whose faces carried more pain than rage. That morning, as he lit his cigarette and looked through the binoculars, he saw her holding the envelope tightly, eyes locked on the gate. It wasn't the same look of passive mourning he had grown used to. This was something else: anticipation. That night, he found the courage to break a rule. During lights out, he quietly approached the barracks, slipping a small note through the edge of her window. "I know you're waiting. Is there someone I can help you reach?" He didn't expect a reply. But the next morning, tucked under the edge of the food tray left on the bench, was an envelope. Inside, a name, a date, A location, Fort Bliss, 1944, and a short sentence. He was transferred. I need to know where. William read the note twice, then burned it in his ashtray. He didn't know what made him care so much. Maybe it was her silence. Maybe it was his own guilt. His brother had died in Bastogne, and he had always wondered what he would do if the roles were reversed. But he made a decision. Over the next 2 weeks, using every contact he had and every excuse he could create, he tried to trace a name, Lieutenant Arthur Kingsley. He called in favors, faked routine paperwork, even contacted a records clerk in D.C. eventually. A classified memo arrived. Kingsley had been stationed in Fort Bliss until October 1944, then transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Maryland after an incident involving a German civilian. Discharged without honors. Status: missing. Rhodes didn't tell her everything, but he gave her enough. He's not dead, but he's gone, he wrote in a final note. And you need to go home now. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But the next day, for the first time since she arrived, Liesel sat with the others during lunch. She ate quietly, but fully. And when the repatriation trucks arrived a week later, she was first in line. As the bus doors opened and the women began boarding, Rhodes watched from the gate. Liesel stepped forward, paused, then turned. Slowly, deliberately, she walked toward the edge of the barbed fence and reached into her coat. She pulled out the photograph and the small envelope, then slid both into a crack between the stones. She looked up at Rhodes, no smile, no tears, and nodded once. Then she got on the bus. It was only later, after the camp had emptied and the sun began to fall, that Rhodes retrieved the items. Inside the envelope, a pressed flower, a folded note, and a ring with initials etched in German. The note read, "If he ever returns, give him this. He'll know who it's from." That night, Sergeant William Rhodes sat alone in the guard tower, the wind brushing through the empty field below. He stared out toward the horizon, the ring in his palm, and whispered to the air, "I hope to God he comes back." Weeks had passed since Camp Raleigh had been decommissioned, its gates welded shut, its barbed wire rolled up and shipped to other military installations that still needed confinement. The wooden barracks, now silent and baking under the unrelenting Texas sun, stood like empty shells of a forgotten time. The war had ended. Soldiers were returning home. Families were rebuilding. But for Sergeant William Rhodes, something remained unfinished. He had taken the envelope home. Not as a souvenir, not as evidence, but because something in it clung to his conscience. The ring was simple silver, old, probably pre-war, with a faint engraving in Gothic German script that read, "Für immer, A." For always, A. He didn't need a map to know what it meant. The note, written in delicate but firm handwriting, had no salutation, no farewell, only that single line, "If he ever returns, give him this." Rhodes had seen many types of loss in his time, young men torn apart on beaches, fathers buried before letters from home could reach them, wives finding out years too late that their husbands were never coming back. But Liesel's grief was different. It was patient. It was quiet. It was like someone who had accepted death long ago, but hadn't stopped hoping for resurrection. And now, holding her final gesture in his hand, Rhodes felt a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. The next morning, he submitted his formal request for reassignment. On paper, it read as a routine transfer request to Fort Meade, Maryland, where Rhodes claimed he had family matters to attend to. In truth, he had one goal: to track down the man named in the sealed record, Lieutenant Arthur Kingsley, a man who had once served, once vanished, and maybe, just maybe, still existed in the cracks of America's post-war silence. It wasn't easy. Military records in 1946 were a labyrinth of half-complete files, handwritten memos, and burned documents. Fort Meade confirmed Kingsley's transfer to a psychiatric facility, but beyond that, the trail went cold. Rhodes visited 3 different hospitals, each time flashing his ID and asking for help under the pretense of following up on a veteran's welfare case. The 4th time, he got lucky dot at St. Elmo's Veterans Hospital. A weary nurse with too many shifts behind her eyes finally nodded when she heard the name. We had someone by that name. Came in 44, discharged in 45, left without giving a forwarding address. But he left something behind. The nurse returned with a small cardboard box. Inside were personal effects, a dog tag, a tattered journal, and a photograph creased and curled at the edges of a young German woman standing under a cherry blossom tree. Rhodes didn't need to guess. It was her. It was Liesel. That night, at a small inn outside the hospital, Rhodes sat at the edge of the bed, turning the journal in his hands. Most of the pages were ramblings, descriptions of dreams, bits of poetry, erratic thoughts. But in the middle, on a page dated October 2nd, 1944, was a single entry written in clear, intentional script. I loved her. They told me she was the enemy, but her silence held more truth than any command I was ever given. I gave her the ring when they dragged her away. They told me I'd forget, but I remember everything. Rhodes closed the book and sat in the stillness for a long time. Somewhere, this man Arthur Kingsley had lived and loved and lost. And somewhere, maybe he was still walking this country's roads, carrying a memory too heavy for anyone else to bear. Rhodes knew what he had to do. If he couldn't find him, maybe he could leave behind the pieces for him to find. Back in Texas, he returned to the site of Camp Raleigh. It was harder now barriers had been set up, and the place was being prepared for demolition. But one night, under cover of darkness, Rhodes slipped through a break in the fence and walked to the stone wall where Liesel had left her message. He reached into the crack where the photograph and ring had once been, and carefully placed the journal inside. Then he added a note of his own. She waited. She believed. If you're still out there, this is yours. Then he left, without looking back. Years went by. The war became a textbook chapter. New conflicts arose, new names filled newspapers, and the old camps were bulldozed for shopping centers and suburbs. But Rhodes never stopped carrying the memory, not in the way that haunted him, but in a way that grounded him. Every time he passed through a train station, saw a woman clutching a letter, or heard German spoken in the distance, something would tighten in his chest. In 1953, he received an unmarked envelope at his home in El Paso. No return address. Inside, a photograph of 2 people and older, man and a woman with streaks of gray in her hair, standing outside a house in upstate New York. On the back, in faded ink, were 5 words. He remembered. And he came. There was no signature. Rhodes sat down at his kitchen table and let the tears come freely. After years of death, orders, and silence, he finally felt something close to peace. He didn't know how they had found each other. Maybe someone had followed the journal's trail. Maybe Kingsley had been searching all along. Or maybe it had taken losing everything to finally go back to where it all began. What mattered now wasn't the war, the uniform, or the chain of command. What mattered was that someone had chosen love over loyalty, that in the ruins of nations and orders, 2 souls had found their way back. And Rhodes just a witness, just a guard, just a man trying to do one thing right, had been a part of it. He folded the photograph and placed it into a drawer beside his service medals. And every year on June 12th, the day Liesel boarded the bus, he lit a candle by his window, not for mourning, but for remembering. The town of New Rochelle in New York wasn't on any map, William Rhodes had ever studied in his military years. But by 1956, it became the place that would live in his mind far more vividly than any battlefield. That was where he finally saw her again, not in person, but in memory, in voice, in shadows that whispered through cracked doors and faded wallpaper. He hadn't expected the photograph to lead anywhere. When he received the envelope, unmarked and weathered, he thought it might be someone playing a cruel joke. But the house in the picture had a name, Owlcrest, carved into a mailbox, half covered in ivy, and quietly sitting on a hill that overlooked a narrow road winding through the trees. It didn't look like a place where wars were remembered. And yet, every brick of that house, every hinge in the door, seemed to carry the weight of unspoken history. He knocked. No one answered. But the porch steps creaked, and a small wind chime above the door whispered a familiar tune. Rhodes sat on the steps for an hour before standing again. He slipped the envelope under the door and turned away, praying that someone inside had recognized his name. He never got a reply. But 2 years later, in a small article buried deep in the back pages of a veteran's newspaper, he read about the passing of a man named Arthur Kingsley. The piece was only a few lines long. No mention of war. No military honors. Just survived by his wife, Elise. Not Liesel. Elise. Rhodes folded the paper and stared at the name for a long time. Was it a misprint? A new life? A reinvention? Maybe it was all three. The past had a strange way of renaming things in America. German became broken English. Captives became neighbors. And a girl who once waited by a camp wall became a woman who served coffee in a quiet town, spoke little, and carried secrets inside books no one else read. Years passed. Rhodes moved to Arizona, retired from service, and spent most of his time writing letters he never sent. One night in 1964, while visiting a museum exhibit in San Antonio about World War II prison camps, he stood before a glass case that held artifacts from Camp Raleigh. Among the items, a cracked tin plate, a pair of worn boots, and a photograph. He froze. The photograph was small, torn on the edge, and yellowed with age, but it was her, Liesel, standing among other POW women, staring just past the camera. The caption below read, "Unidentified German pose, Camp Raleigh. 1945. Double quotes, unidentified. He leaned in, resting his hand on the glass, and whispered. Her name was Liesel. That night, he wrote a letter to the museum director, enclosing a copy of the photograph he had received years earlier, and a short note. This woman had a name and a story. Don't let her be forgotten. He didn't expect anything to come of it. But a month later, he received a call from the museum. The director sounded cautious, almost reverent. "Mr. Rhodes," she said, "we received your materials. There's something you need to see." He returned to San Antonio. The director handed him a binder filled with notes. Apparently, another visitor, a woman in her 70s, had seen the same photo and had burst into tears. Her name was Ingrid. She claimed to be Liesel's niece. She told a story that mirrored Rhodes in parts and diverged in others. Liesel had returned to Germany briefly after the war, but came back to the U.S. under the Displaced Persons Act. She had settled in New York, changed her name, and rarely spoke of the camp. She never had children. She worked in a library. She had kept a small wooden box by her bed that no one was allowed to touch. When she died, that box was given to Ingrid. Inside, a faded military ID, a silver ring, and a letter never mailed addressed to A.K. in handwriting that had thinned with age, but still carried strength. Rhodes asked if he could see it. Ingrid agreed. She met him days later at a quiet cafe in Houston. carrying a manila envelope wrapped in twine. She placed it on the table without a word. Rhodes opened it slowly. The letter inside was brief. Arthur, if you are reading this, it means you remembered me. Or someone helped you. I never stopped waiting. I only stopped asking. You gave me a moment of dignity in a place built to erase us. You called me human when others called me enemy. That was enough to make the war survivable. I don't know if you'll find this before I'm gone, but if you do know that you were loved. Rhodes folded the letter with trembling fingers. For the first time in decades, he wept openly. Ingrid reached across the table and placed her hand over his. She mentioned you once, she said. Just once. She said, there was a guard once. He saw me. That night, Rhodes walked through the city, past lights and traffic, into the quiet hum of midnight. He stopped at a park bench, sat down, and looked at the sky. Stars overhead shimmered faintly, distant yet familiar-like voices carried from another time. He wondered how many other stories had been buried. How many names had faded into records as unidentified? How many Liesels and Arthurs had existed, only to be folded into silence by the machinery of war and history? He had spent his life wearing a uniform, saluting flags, obeying orders. But the only thing that had ever felt like duty was what he had done for her. And it was not enough. He knew that. Now, not because he failed, but because she deserved more than memory. She deserved to be told. William Rhodes never expected to become a man defined by absence. He had worn uniforms, taken oaths, received medals, and led men through the noise and fire of the greatest war the world had known. But none of those things etched themselves into his soul the way Liesel had. She had been a presence for such a brief time, and yet her absence had grown roots in his life, branching into every decision, every silence, every breath he had taken since the camp gates closed behind them. He carried the ring she had left behind, not on his finger. It never felt right. Instead, he kept it in a small tin box, the kind soldiers used to hold tobacco or sewing kits. The box was dented, faded, and unremarkable to anyone else. But to him, it was the only relic of a moment in time when humanity had cut through orders and ranks and uniforms. After his meeting with Ingrid, Rhodes wrote one final letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone. He wrote it as a record, perhaps a confession, perhaps a tribute. He didn't know if it would ever be read. He folded the pages, placed them in the tin box with the ring, and locked it in his desk drawer. Years passed. He grew slower. His walks shorter. The coffee at the local diner became bitterer, or perhaps his tongue just dulled with age. He didn't talk much about the war anymore. When neighbors asked, he just nodded politely, gave a vague answer, and changed the subject. The only time he spoke of it in detail was when a local high school invited him for Veterans Day. He stood before a room of teenagers who barely looked up from their phones, and he told them about the mud in Belgium, the cold nights in Normandy, and the dust of Texas. But he never said her name. He couldn't. It felt like it would open something too wide, too raw, too sacred. One spring, Rhodes decided to donate his belongings to the War Museum in San Antonio, the same place where he had seen Liesel's photo. He packed a box with his medals, dog tags, a pair of worn boots, and the tin container. He included the letter. He didn't tell them what was inside. He just wrote, "This matters. Please keep it safe." The curator, a younger man named Luis Delgado, opened the package weeks later. Inside, he found the contents as described. The letter was brief, stained in parts, written in a neat hand. "If you ever display this, don't talk about battles. Talk about the girl behind the fence who never stopped being human, even when the world demanded she stop. Her name was Liesel. I was just a soldier. She was everything else." Delgado read the letter twice, then a third time. He decided to act. The museum's World War II exhibit was redesigned over the next year. They built a small corner intimate, quiet dedicated to POWs, who were never officially recognized. Among them was a display with a black and white photo of Liesel, the tin box, and a printed version of Rhodes' letter. A small placard underneath read, "In memory of Liesel," a name remembered. Visitors often passed by it without stopping. It wasn't as flashy as the tanks or uniforms, but once in a while someone would linger, read the letter, and step back with wet eyes. One of those people was a woman named Emily Carver. A documentary filmmaker from Boston. Emily had been researching lesser-known World War II narratives, especially stories involving displaced women and foreign POWs on American soil. When she stumbled upon Liesel's story, something struck her. It wasn't just the tragedy, but the restraint. The fact that neither Liesel nor Rhodes had ever tried to turn their connection into something public, something political, something more than what it truly was, a moment of decency in an indecent time. She contacted the museum, read every archived document they had, and began piecing together a script. 3 years later, the documentary aired on PBS under the title, "A Ring in the Dust, the Story of Liesel and the Guard." It was quiet, reflective, haunting. No dramatic music, no reenactments, just voiceovers of letters, slow pans over barbed wire, interviews with historians and former guards who spoke of women POWs not as enemies, but as people who survived through silence. The final scene was a simple shot of the ring, resting in the tin box, fading into black dot when the credits rolled. Donations poured in to expand the POW exhibit. Veterans sent letters. Grandchildren of former guards wrote in, asking if their own relatives might have met women like Liesel. And in a small home in Arizona. William Rhodes watched the documentary alone. He sat in the dark, face lit only by the flickering images on the screen. He didn't cry. He just nodded, once, slowly, like a man acknowledging something long overdue. A week later, his neighbor found him in his armchair, eyes closed, hands resting over a folded blanket. Gone. No funeral parade. No bugle call. Just a quiet note found beside his bed. If anyone asks, tell them I found peace. The museum later received one final donation in his name, a bundle of letters, including one from Liesel that had never been opened. The envelope was yellowed, edges torn, but her handwriting still clear. Inside, "Arthur, you never belonged to the war. You belonged to yourself. That's what made you different. That's what saved me. If you ever wonder what you meant to me, remember this. I saw you. I saw the man you were. Not the soldier. Not the guard. The man, and I was never afraid when you were near." The letter is now framed at the museum. Visitors pause and read it in silence. And in that silence, for a moment, they know her name. They know his story. And for once, the war does not win.